Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's been quite a bunch of days, and I'm really glad you're here because we need to get out of this funk that the world is in. And I just have to say, before I start, that Rob Reiner was a most amazing friend to writer's block. He never said no, ever. And from programs with Arianna Huffington 1,000 years ago to Al Franken to Joy Reid, and most recently his own book, his hilarious book. I was so proud to have worked with him and so grateful for everything he did for me and for writer's block. So, that said, thank you. Please turn your cell phones off. And again, thanks for coming to tonight's program, In the Dark, in the Night, a celebration of the great American writer Shirley Jackson. I'm Andrea Grossman, founder of Writer's Block, now in our 30th season. I know, wow, because... Before we get to tonight's program, I want to thank my friends here at the Ebell for sharing this most gorgeous room. If you haven't looked up, look up at the ceiling and look up. Oh, it's so great. I love this room. The Ebell is a membership organization built by women for women. It welcomes your membership, and I urge you to join. They offer programs on art, music, and literature, and they have good parties. So. I want to thank our participants this evening, and what a cast of characters we've got. First, my friend Benjamin Dreyer, whom you'll meet in a moment, author of the fabulously popular and most important writer's reference book, Dreyer's English, but it's really much more fun than that. And he's also an editor, or he was the editor of a collection of Shirley Jackson's stories. He's a retired copy chief and managing editor at Random House with a very special connection to Shirley Jackson and to Lawrence Hyman, Shirley Jackson's son. And we'll get to him in a moment, too. My dear and wonderful friend, Kerry O'Malley, opens her Rolodex to me on a regular basis. Rolodex, I love saying Rolodex, okay. She's a terrific actor who can be seen right now on the hit Netflix show, A Man on the Inside. And her recent roles include Night Bitch, David Fincher's The Killer, and The 6888. Annabeth Gish is another wonderful actor whose TV and film credits include Barry, Succession, Pretty Little Liars, and so many more. She also appeared in the Netflix adaptation, The Haunting of Hill House. But what's really the most important thing that I mentioned about Annabeth and Kerry is that they went to Duke together, and they were in Brotherhood that you can see on Showtime. We have the pleasure of presenting one other guest, Lawrence Hyman, whom I mentioned, who brings not only further expertise on Shirley Jackson, but he brings actual family of Shirley Jackson. He's her son. He has a whole slews of generations with him of Shirley Jackson people tonight. They're all in the front row, and I urge you to say hi to them afterwards, because Lawrence came down from Sonoma for tonight's program, so I'm deeply grateful. So here's what's going to happen tonight. I'm going to chat with Lawrence and Benjamin Dreyer for a few minutes to help put her stories and her work into some context for an audience of 2025. Then sit back and enjoy Kerry O'Malley's reading of one of my favorite Shirley stories. like Mother used to make. Annabeth will then read Pillar of Salt, a story any newcomer to Manhattan might relate to. And to top all this off, Benjamin, Kerry, and Annabeth will read a short and chilling segment of Hill House. So please welcome Lawrence Hyman and Benjamin Dreyer to the stage. And when we are through, Benjamin will give a brief introduction to each story. Book Soup was supposed to be here tonight with copies of the Shirley Jackson, some Shirley Jackson collections and Benjamin's Dreyer's English, but the Book Soup bookseller was in a bad car accident on his way here. He's okay, but his car isn't, and so he didn't make it. We're glad he's okay. What a week, right, guys? Yeah. What a week. So, Benjamin, I'm starting off with you. Why are we celebrating Shirley Jackson?
We're celebrating Shirley Jackson because you allowed me to celebrate Shirley Jackson in this space. Shirley Jackson is I'm going to say my favorite American writer and has been for decades. About 10 years ago, I found out because the editorial meeting at Random House was abuzz that we had acquired a collection of previously uncollected material by Shirley Jackson. A lot of the stuff in the book had also never been published and existed in nothing more than the first drafts, which you can always recognize because they're all lowercase typing. Too much energy to hit the shift key. David Ebershoff, who acquired the book for Random House, and I immediately laid claim to the notion that whatever dusting off was going to need to be done on this text, whatever copy editing was going to need to be done, I was going to do it. David thought it would be a good idea for me to get on the phone with Lawrence and with his sister, Sarah, who were the co-editors of this volume, and to establish that I knew what I was talking about. And the lovely thing that happened was that I said, I was just listening to those two recordings that your mother made of The Lottery and The Demon Lover, which you can get from Smithsonian Folkways, by the way, and they're really good. And I said, and I'm listening to these recordings, and it's very exciting for me. And you said...
Well, actually, hi. I said, yes, I had made those recordings. My mother was very unwilling to go into a recording studio. She didn't like to be photographed, and she didn't like to be recorded. So she asked me if I would do it on my father's Revere reel-to-reel recorder. So we set up in what we used to call the music room in the front of the house, and Shirley made herself a bourbon and water. This was 6 o'clock in the evening.
Hold the
mic. Sorry.
Is
it better?
We want to hear about the bourbon and water.
And so Shirley had a bourbon and water, and I set up the microphone on a pillow in front of her. It was extremely amateurish, and she proceeded to read them. And partway through, you can hear, to this day, you can hear the ice tinkling in her glass at one point.
The other thing was, so I'm listening, I got my headset on, and I'm listening and I'm reading, I have my collection, of my Shirley Jackson collection, and I'm reading and I turn a page and I'm like, did she just turn a page?
Yes,
and then
indeed.
I'm reading some more and then I turn a page and she turns a page, because we're reading out of the same book.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so Shirley wrote literary fiction. Her stories appeared in all sorts of great publications, including The New Yorker. She's sometimes referred to as the Queen of American Gothic literature. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that's fine. It's one of the genres she wrote in. Obviously, she wrote in many. She had a Gothic style of writing, but a very sparse, wonderful way of, and Benjamin has commented on this at length, of punctuating her work. She also wrote the Family Chronicles, as we call them, the two books which were originally a lot of short stories she wrote about our family.
How do you like seeing your family portrayed in a bookstore. Was that, what was that like?
Well, at the time, I wasn't overly fond of it, but as I grew older, I realized that they were really wonderful stories. And my siblings and I often joke that we're not sure sometimes whether what we remember is what we really remember or what Shirley wrote, and we know about that. Because she captured a lot of our personalities in a very Shirley Jackson sort of way.
Lawrence takes care of the estate of Shirley Jackson. I want both of you to talk about her popularity from when she started writing stories to now, to her position in the American literary canon. Can both of you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my fondness for her writing is matched by my respect for her writing, because I think that her prose style is just absolutely impeccable. It's just one great sentence after another, and because I have a tendency maybe to get chips on my shoulders about the things that I really like, the notion that she would be sort of on this like weird Gothic genre shelf, when I think that she's as great an American writer as any great American writer of the mid-20th century, so I'm always like pumping for, it's like pumping for Shirley Jackson's reputation. To then see her enshrined in a Library of America volume.
Yep.
And then, as I was saying to Andrea, I didn't realize until a couple of weeks ago that they did a second
They did, yeah.
one. And so then, of course, I immediately had to get the box set.
Good, good, thank you.
But it is, I think it's wonderful to see her take her place, take her appropriate place, as simply as a great American writer, not a great American writer, but.
Well, yeah, thank you for saying that, because I agree with you. And she is enormously popular these days, as I was telling Andrea, especially in Europe. But I authorize translations practically every day of the week in
Lawrence, hold the mic.
obscure languages. I just did some Belarus translations the other day, and cover designs. She's enormously popular right now in the UK, and has been in recent years, where we are actually doing 2 stage adaptations later this year. One of The Haunting of Hill House, which I'm very excited about because it has a hydraulic movable set, and I can't wait to see how that's going to be. And another stage adaptation of We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which is my favorite of her novels and was her favorite of her novels, and widely considered her masterpiece, and it certainly holds up, I think, beautifully these days, as do her other stories. We're doing a film adaptation of The Sundial, which is chillingly relevant right now. My daughter Gretchen and I have been working on that, and we're also working on a collection of her short stories, which we've modeled into an episodic series called The Possibility of Evil, and we're very excited about that. And there are any number of other adaptations underway for film, a couple of stage, one a ballet and an opera. So lots of things are going on, and not least of which, of course, is her books, which continue to be popular and sell well, I'm very happy to say. And she went through a period, maybe in the 70s and 80s, where she a little bit fell out of popularity, or people had kind of forgotten about her. And then things started to really rev up in the 80s and 90s, and now it's really very, very busy and very exciting.
That's great, very gratifying.
I know, and but I want to know why her popularity has grown. And that's really fascinating, because her stories have been kicking around for how many years? Since 1950, essentially, or 48?
65 or 70 years, yeah.
Okay. So it's terrific that her popularity just keeps going up, and I'm curious as to what you, Benjamin, as an editor, also make of that, and tell me why.
I think that she comes under the heading of she is a writer's writer. Many of the writers that I know, worship her prose style, admire her writing. I also think that her portrayal, there's a sort of a through line of well-meaning women put into situations that get very much out of hand through no fault of their own, and they're not all Tessie Hutchinson facing down rocks.
That's the lottery. It's such a creepy story. It's so scary. Creepy meaning could be 2025. Yeah.
But I think that a lot of writers, and I think that particularly a lot of women writers have been advocating for her as an important voice from earlier decades. Who it shouldn't just be, with all respect to them, it shouldn't just be Cheever and Bellow and Updike. It should be Cheever and Bellow and Updike and Jackson.
Right. Okay. Good. Benjamin, I know there were a few things you wanted to ask Lawrence about specifically, and I might have forgotten them because I accidentally deleted a page in my notes here. And so if you remember, if I haven't covered anything that you want to ask Lawrence.
I think I only had one question left, and it was just sort of a particular point of my own curiosity. I was just stumbling upon this in the letters where she's talking about her burgeoning reputation as she's becoming more popular, and she says, "Yeah, people are comparing me to Saki and to John Collier and to Truman Capote, and I don't actually really care for them too much." Who were the writers? Were there writers that she particularly admired? Were there writers that she went out of her way to meet that you know of?
Well, not that I recall. She was very good friends with Ralph Ellison. Both Ralph and Fanny visited us often. In fact, Ralph lived with us for a summer while he was completing Invisible Man. And we were good friends with the Malamuds, Bernard Malamud and his wife Anne. And they were close colleagues. Both Bern and my father were teachers at Bennington College, so we saw them often professionally and socially. But this gives me a chance to talk about the fact that my mother is often, her writing confused a lot of critics, because while on the one hand she wrote Gothic novels and short stories, some of them very chilling, some not so much, some just very thought-provoking, but she also wrote the family chronicles, as we call them, the humorous stories about me and my siblings. And so people didn't really know how to categorize her. And I think she suffered because of that. They didn't, for a while, critics didn't take her as seriously as they should have because of that, because she wrote in greatly different styles. And the truth of it is, she just loved to write. It didn't matter. She wrote letters prolifically, as Benjamin knows. She wrote short stories prolifically. We found when we were publishing the two books we did, Just an Ordinary Day and Let Me Tell You, of her previously unpublished and uncollected work, that there were literally hundreds of short stories. Hundreds. And we would bring back stacks of material from the Library of Congress, much of which had never been published, and we went through it, and we went through it over and over until we found stories we thought were not only publishable, but quite wonderful. And in the process, we discovered some, like The Man in the Woods and Paranoia, that had never been published. Or often stories were published in the women's magazines in the 50s, Charm and Good Housekeeping, which in a way supported our household, it's true. But after publication, they were lost. And we rediscovered them, and they were wonderful, many of them. Some weren't as good as others, but there were so many. And the letters, when I got going on the letters book, there were, I think, 1,500 pages. And I wrestled and wrestled with my publisher over how to deal with that. And they kept raising my page limit to where we ended up with a very respectable 620, I think.
Do you have another collection? It sounds like there are plenty of stories left. Do you have another collection brewing?
We've talked about it. I'm not sure. There's so much good attention on what is already published that I think we might leave it there for a while and concentrate on some adaptations.
Okay, good. And one last question for you, Benjamin. As one of the great editors at Random House, one of the most admired, because everybody at Random House loves you, if one of her stories from 1948 or 1952 were to cross your desk now, how would you look at it? How would you as an editor respond?
When I was looking at the manuscript collection that became Let Me Tell You, everything just really sort of jumped up at me. And of course I knew it was her. Obviously. But there was such skill on the page, and I was trying to navigate in my own brain what my limits were going to be, what permission I was going to give myself to do things. And I very quickly realized, and it was a lovely collaboration between her and me, that they didn't need much. A comma every now and then, maybe like throw in one word or pull one word out. But the sheer skill, and as much as I will always appreciate reading, writers who are just sort of, wonderful, have huge imaginations, great flights of literary fancy. It's the craftsmanship that really appeals to me because that's my life in literature, is the craft of it.
Well, thanks to, we want to have time to fully enjoy the actual stories. So we're going to stop blathering, and Benjamin, you are going to set up the two stories that we're going to hear individually. You're going to give a bit of an introduction and and just say, here's Kerry, and here's the story we're reading,
Yep.
etc. Okay.
That's my assignment.
Okay, that's your assignment. Thank you.
Good. So, as Andrea said, we've got two short stories, Like Mother Used to Make and Pillar of Salt, and then we're going to do a brief and particularly exquisite excerpt from The Haunting of Hill House. When I was looking through the books of short stories to try to figure out which ones were the right ones, I immediately landed on Like Mother Used to Make because it is blackly funny in a sort of characteristic Shirley Jackson fashion. It is also the only story of hers I can think of whose protagonist can be taken to be a gay man. And for all of her women in peril, so now you're going to get introduced to a gay man in peril. Like Mother Used to Make first appeared in the story collection that we now know as The Lottery and Other Stories, which was originally published as The Lottery, The Adventures of James Harris. And James Harris is a figure who appears in a handful of the stories in this volume, and all you really need to know is that any time the name James Harris comes up, a bad situation is about to get worse. And I think that does it. I think that's what we need. Kerry, you're up.
Like mother used to make. David Turner, who did everything in small, quick movements, hurried from the bus stop down the avenue toward the street. He reached the grocery on the corner and hesitated. There had been something. Butter, he remembered with relief. This morning, all the way up the avenue to his bus stop, he had been telling himself, butter, don't forget butter coming home tonight. When you pass the grocery, remember butter. He went into the grocery and waited his turn, examining the cans on the shelves. Canned pork sausage was back, and corned beef hash. A tray full of rolls caught his eye, and then the woman ahead of him went out, and the clerk turned to him. "How much is butter?" David asked cautiously. "$89, the clerk said easily. $89, David frowned. "That's what it is," the clerk said. He looked past David at the next customer. "Quarter of a pound, please," David said, "and a half dozen rolls." Carrying his package home, he thought, I really ought not to trade there anymore. You'd think they'd know me well enough to be more courteous. There was a letter from his mother in the mailbox. He snuck into the top of the bag of rolls and went upstairs to the 3rd floor. No light in Marcia's apartment, the only other apartment on the floor. David turned to his own door and unlocked it, snapping on the light as he came in the door. Tonight, as every night when he came home, the apartment looked warm and friendly and good. The little foyer with the neat small table and 4 careful chairs, and the bowl of little marigolds against the pale green walls David had painted himself. Beyond, the kitchenette, and beyond that, the big room where David read and slept, and the ceiling of which was a perpetual trouble to him. The plaster was falling in one corner, and no power on earth could make it less noticeable. David consoled himself for the plaster constantly with the thought that perhaps if he had not taken an apartment in an old brownstone, the plaster would not be falling. But then, too, for the money he paid, he could not have found a foyer and a big room and a kitchenette anywhere else. He put his bag down on the table and put the butter away in the refrigerator and the rolls in the bread box. He folded the empty bag and put it in a drawer in the kitchenette. Then he hung his coat in the hall closet and went into the big room, which he called his living room, and lighted the desk light. His word for the room, in his own mind, was charming. He'd always been partial to yellows and browns, and he had painted the desk and the bookcases and the end tables himself, had even painted the walls, and had hunted around the city for the exact tweedish tan drapes he had in mind. The room satisfied him. The rug was a rich, dark brown that picked up the darkest thread in the drapes. The furniture was almost yellow. The cover on the studio couch and the lampshades were orange. The rows of plants on the windowsills gave the touch of green the room needed. Right now, David was looking for an ornament to set on the end table, but he had his heart set on a low, translucent green bowl for more marigolds. And such things cost more than he could afford after the silverware. He could not come into this room without feeling that it was the most comfortable home he had ever had. Tonight, as always, he let his eyes move slowly around the room, from couch to drapes to bookcase, imagined the green bowl on the end table, and sighed as he turned to the desk. He took his pen from the holder and a sheet of the neat notepaper sitting in one of the desk cubbyholes and wrote carefully, "Dear Marcia, don't forget you're coming for dinner tonight. I'll expect you at 6. He signed the note with a D and picked up the key to Marcia's apartment, which lay in the flat pencil tray on his desk. He had a key to Marcia's apartment because she was never home when her laundryman came, or when the man came to fix the refrigerator or the telephone or the windows, and someone had to let them in because the landlord was reluctant to climb 3 flights of stairs with the passkey. Marcia had never suggested having a key to David's apartment, and he had never offered her one. It pleased him to have only one key to his home, and that safely in his own pocket. It had a pleasant feeling to him, solid and small, the only way into his warm, fine home. He left his front door open and went down the dark hall to the other apartment. He opened the door with his key and turned on the light. This apartment was not agreeable for him to come into. It was exactly the same as his, foyer, kitchenette, living room, and it reminded him constantly of his first day in his own apartment, when the thought of the careful homemaking to be done had left him very close to despair. Marcia's home was bare and at random. An upright piano a friend had given her recently stood crookedly, half in the foyer because the little room was too narrow, and the big room was too cluttered for it to sit comfortably anywhere. Marcia's bed was unmade, and piles of dirty laundry lay on the floor. The window had been open all day, and papers had blown wildly around the floor. David closed the window, hesitated over the papers, and then moved away quickly. He put the note on the piano keys and locked the door behind him. In his own apartment, he settled down happily to making dinner. He had made a little pot roast for dinner the night before. Most of it was still in the refrigerator, and he sliced it in fine, thin slices and arranged it on a plate with parsley. His plates were orange, almost the same color as the couch cover, and it was pleasant to him to arrange a salad with the lettuce on the orange plate and the thin slices of cucumber. He put coffee on to cook and sliced potatoes to fry, and then, with his dinner cooking agreeably and the window open to lose the odor of the frying potatoes, he set lovingly to arranging his table. First, the tablecloth, pale green, of course, and the 2 fresh green napkins, the orange plates, and the precise cup and saucer at each plate, the plate of rolls in the center, and the odd salt and pepper shakers like 2 green frogs. 2 glasses, they came from the 5 and 10, but they had thin green bands around them. And finally, with great care, the silverware. Gradually, tenderly, David was buying himself a complete set of silverware. Starting out modestly with a service for 2, he had added to it until now he had well over a service for 4, although not quite a service for 6, lacking salad forks and soup spoons. He had chosen a sedate, pretty pattern, one that would be fine with any sort of table setting. And each morning he gloried in a breakfast that started with a shining silver spoon for his grapefruit, and had a compact butter knife for his toast, and a solid heavy knife to break his eggshell, and a fresh silver spoon for his coffee, which he sugared with a particular spoon meant only for sugar. The silverware lay in a tarnish-proof box on a high shelf all to itself, and David lifted it down carefully to take out a service for 2. It made a lavish display set out on the table. Knives, forks, salad forks, more forks for the pie, a spoon to each plate, and the special serving pieces, the sugar spoon, the large serving spoons for the potatoes and the salad, the fork for the meat, and the pie fork. When the table held as much silverware as 2 people could possibly use, he put the box back on the shelf and stood back, checking everything and admiring the table, shining and clean. Then he went into his living room to read his mother's letter and wait for Marcia. The potatoes were done before Marcia came, and then suddenly the door burst open and Marcia arrived with a shout and a fresh air and disorder. She was a tall, handsome girl with a loud voice, wearing a dirty raincoat, and she said, "I didn't forget. I'm just late as usual. What's for dinner? You're not mad, are you?" David got up and came over to take her coat. "I left a note for you," he said. "Didn't see it," Marcia said. "Hadn't been home." "Something smells good." "Fried potatoes," David said. "Everything's ready." Golly! Marcia fell into a chair to sit with her legs stretched out in front of her and her arms hanging. "Oh, I'm tired," she said. "It's cold out." "It was getting colder when I came home," David said. He was putting dinner on the table, the platter of meat, the salad, the bowl of fried potatoes. He walked quietly back and forth from the kitchenette to the table, avoiding Marcia's feet. "I don't believe you have been here since I got my silverware," he said. Marcia swung around to the table and picked up a spoon. "It's beautiful," she said, running her finger along the pattern. "Pleasure to eat with it." "Dinner's ready," David said. He pulled her chair out for her and waited for her to sit down. Marcia was always hungry. She put meat and potatoes and salad on her plate without admiring the serving silver, and started to eat enthusiastically. "Everything's beautiful," she said once. "Food is wonderful, Davy." "I'm glad you like it," David said. He liked the feel of the fork in his hand, even the sight of the fork moving up to Marcia's mouth. Marcia waved her hand largely. I mean, everything, she said. Furniture, a nice place you have here, and dinner and everything. I like things this way, David said. I know you do. Marcia's voice was mournful. Someone should teach me, I guess. You ought to keep your home neater, David said. You ought to get curtains at least and keep your windows shut. Ah, I never remember, she said. Davy, you were the most wonderful cook. She pushed her plate away and sighed. David blushed happily. I'm glad you like it, he said again. And then he laughed. I made a pie last night. A pie? Marcia looked at him for a minute, and then she said, apple? David shook his head, and she said, pineapple? And he shook his head again, and because he couldn't wait to tell her, said, cherry! Ah, my God! Marcia got up and followed him into the kitchen and looked over his shoulder while he took the pie carefully out of the bread box. Is this the first pie you ever made? I've made 2 before, David admitted, but this one turned out better than the others. She watched happily while he cut large pieces of pie and put them on other orange plates. And then she carried her own plate back to the table, tasted the pie, and made wordless gestures of appreciation. David tasted his pie and said critically, I think it's a little sour. I ran out of sugar. It's perfect, Marcia said. I always loved a cherry pie really sour. This isn't sour enough even. David cleared the table and poured the coffee, and as he was setting the coffee pot back on the stove, Marcia said, my doorbell's ringing. She opened the apartment door and listened, and they could hear the ring in her apartment. She pressed the buzzer in David's apartment that opened the downstairs door, and far away they could hear heavy footsteps starting up the stairs. Marcia left the apartment door open and came back to her coffee. Landlord, most likely, she said. I didn't pay my rent again. When the footsteps reached the top of the last staircase, Marcia yelled, hello, leaning back in her chair to see out the door into the hall. Then she said, why, Mr. Harris. She got up and went to the door and held out her hand. Come in, she said. I just thought I'd stop by, Mr. Harris said. He was a very large man, and his eyes rested curiously on the coffee cups and empty plates on the table. I didn't want to interrupt your dinner. That's all right, Marcia said, pulling him into the room. It's just Davy. Davy, this is Mr. Harris. He works in my office. This is Mr. Turner. How do you do? David said politely. And the man looked at him carefully and said, how do you do? Sit down, Marcia was saying, pushing a chair forward. Davy, how about another cup for Mr. Harris? Please don't bother, Mr. Harris said quickly. I just thought that I'd stop by. While David was taking out another cup and saucer and getting a spoon down from the tarnish-proof silver box, Marcia said, you like homemade pie? Say, Mr. Harris said admiringly, I've forgotten what homemade pie looks like. Davy, Marcia called cheerfully, how about cutting Mr. Harris a piece of that pie? Without answering, David took a fork out of the silver box and got down an orange plate and put a piece of pie on it. His plans for the evening had been vague. They had involved perhaps a movie if it were not too cold out, or at least a short talk with Marcia about the state of her home. Mr. Harris was settling down in his chair, and when David put the pie down silently in front of him, he stared at it admiringly for a minute before he tasted it. Say, he said finally, this is certainly some pie. He looked at Marcia. This is really good pie, he said. You like it? Marcia asked modestly. She looked up at David and smiled at him over Mr. Harris's head. I haven't made but 2-3 pies before, she said. David raised a hand to protest, but Mr. Harris turned to him and demanded, did you ever eat any better pie in your whole life? Oh, I don't think Davy liked it much, Marcia said wickedly. I think it was too sour for him. I like a sour pie, Mr. Harris said. He looked suspiciously at David. A cherry pie has got to be sour. I'm glad you liked it anyway, Marcia said. Mr. Harris ate the last mouthful of pie, finished his coffee, and sat back. I'm sure glad I dropped in, he said to Marcia. David's desire to be rid of Mr. Harris had slid imperceptibly into an urgency to be rid of them both. His clean house, his nice silver, were not meant as vehicles for the kind of fatuous banter Marcia and Mr. Harris were playing at together. Almost roughly, he took the coffee cup away from the arm Marcia had stretched across the table, took it out to the kitchenette, and came back and put his hand on Mr. Harris's cup. Don't bother, Davy, honestly, Marcia said. She looked up, smiling again, as though she and David were conspirators against Mr. Harris. I'll do them all tomorrow, honey, she said. Sure, Mr. Harris said. He stood up. Let them wait. Let's go in and sit down where we can be comfortable. Marcia got up and led him into the living room, and they sat down on the studio couch. Come on in, Davy, Marcia called. The sight of his pretty table, covered with dirty dishes and cigarette ashes, held David. He carried the plates and the cups and the silverware into the kitchenette and stacked them in the sink, and then, because he could not endure the thought of their sitting there any longer, with the dirt gradually hardening on them, he tied an apron on and began to wash them carefully. Now and then, while he was washing them and drying them and putting them away, Marcia would call to him sometimes, Davy, what are you doing? Or, Davy, won't you stop all that and come sit down? Once she said, Davy, I don't want you to wash all those dishes. And Mr. Harris said, let him work. He's happy. David put the clean yellow cups and saucers back on the shelves. By now, Mr. Harris's cup was unrecognizable. You could not tell from the clean rows of cups which one he had used, or which one had been stained with Marcia's lipstick, or which one had held David's coffee, which he had finished in the kitchenette. And finally, taking the tarnish-proof box down, he put the silverware away. First the forks all went together into the little grooves which held 2 forks each. Later, when the set was complete, each groove would hold 4 forks. And then the spoons, stacked up neatly one on top of another in their own grooves, and the knives in even order, all facing the same way in the special tapes in the lid of the box. Butter knives and serving spoons and the pie knife all went into their own places, and then David put the lid down on the lovely shining set and put the box back on the shelf. After wringing out the dishcloth and hanging up the dish towel and taking off his apron, he was through, and he went slowly into the living room. Marcia and Mr. Harris were sitting close together on the studio couch, talking earnestly. My father's name was James, Marcia was saying as David came in, as though she were clinching an argument. She turned around when David came in and said, Davy, you were so nice to do all those dishes yourself. That's all right, David said awkwardly. Mr. Harris was looking at him impatiently. I should have helped you, Marcia said. There was a silence, and then Marcia said, Sit down, Davy, won't you? David recognized her tone. It was the one hostesses used when they didn't know what else to say to you, or when you had come too early, or stayed too late. It was the tone he had expected to use on Mr. Harris. James and I were just talking about, Marcia began and then stopped and laughed. What were we talking about? She asked, turning to Mr. Harris. Nothing much, Mr. Harris said. He was still watching David. Well, Marcia said, letting her voice trail off. She turned to David and smiled brightly and then said, Well, again. Mr. Harris picked up the ashtray from the end table and set it on the couch between himself and Marcia. He took a cigar out of his pocket and said to Marcia, Do you mind cigars? And when Marcia shook her head, he unwrapped the cigar tenderly and bit off the end. Cigar smoke's good for plants, he said thickly, around the cigar as he lighted it, and Marcia laughed. David stood up. For a minute he thought he was going to say something that might start, Mr. Harris, I will thank you to... But what he actually said, finally, with both Marcia and Mr. Harris looking at him, was, Guess I better be getting along, Marcia. Mr. Harris stood up and said heartily, "Certainly have enjoyed meeting you." He held out his hand, and David shook hands limply. "Guess I better be getting along," he said again to Marcia, and she stood up and said, "I'm sorry you have to leave so soon." "Lots of work to do," David said, much more genially than he intended, and Marcia smiled at him again as though they were conspirators and went over to the desk and said, "Don't forget your key." Surprised, David took the key of her apartment from her and said good night to Mr. Harris and went to the outside door. "Good night, Davy, honey," Marcia called out, and David said, "Thanks for a simply wonderful dinner, Marcia," and closed the door behind him. He went down the hall and let himself into Marcia's apartment. The piano was still awry, the papers were still on the floor, the laundry scattered, the bed unmade. David sat down on the bed and looked around. It was cold, it was dirty, and as he thought miserably of his own warm home, he heard faintly down the hall the sound of laughter and the scrape of a chair being moved. Then, still faintly, the sound of his radio. Wearily, David leaned over and picked up a paper from the floor, and then he began to gather them up, one by one.
Next up, Annabeth Gish is going to read Pillar of Salt, which doesn't really take too much introduction from me, except to say that it is maybe the most Shirley Jackson story I can think of. It initially appeared, and this really sort of tells you a lot about the world as it used to be, it initially appeared in Mademoiselle magazine, which was one of the magazines, besides the New Yorker, that Shirley Jackson published in. She published in McCall's and she published in Red Book. But this one was in the Slicks, they called them. But this one was in Mademoiselle. And well, I've heard Annabeth read this once, and so now now you're going to have that. You're going to have that pleasure. Annabeth Gish.
For some reason, a tune was running through her head when she and her husband got on the train in New Hampshire for their trip to New York, and they had not been to New York for nearly a year. But the tune was from farther back than that. It was from the days when she was 15 or 16 and had never seen New York except in movies, when the city was made up, to her, of penthouses filled with Noel Coward people, when the height and speed and luxury and gaiety that made up a city like New York were confused inextricably with the dullness of being 15 and beauty unreachable and far in the movies. "What is that tune?" she said to her husband, and hummed it. "It's from some old movie, I think." "I know it," he said, and hummed it himself. "Can't remember the words." He sat back comfortably. He had hung up their coats, put the suitcases on the rack, and had taken his magazine out. "I'll think of it sooner or later," he said. She looked out the window first, tasting it almost secretly, savoring the extreme pleasure of being on a moving train with nothing to do for 6 hours but read and nap and go into the dining car, going farther and farther every minute from the children, from the kitchen floor, with even the hills being incredibly left behind, changing into fields and trees too far away from home to be daily. "I love trains," she said, and her husband nodded sympathetically into his magazine. 2 weeks ahead, 2 unbelievable weeks with all arrangements made, no further planning to do, except perhaps what theaters or what restaurants. A friend with an apartment went on a convenient vacation. There was enough money in the bank to make a trip to New York compatible with new snowsuits for the children. There was the smoothness of unopposed arrangements, once the initial obstacles had been overcome, as though when they had really made up their minds, nothing dared stop them. The baby's sore throat cleared up, the plumber came, finished his work in 2 days and left. The dresses had been altered in time. The hardware store could be left safely, once they had found the excuse of looking over new city products. New York had not burned down, had not been quarantined, Their friend had gone away according to schedule, and Brad had found the keys to the apartment in his pocket. Everyone knew where to reach everyone else. There was a list of plays not to miss and a list of items to look out for in the stores: diapers, dress materials, fancy canned goods, tarnish-proof silverware boxes. And finally, the train was there, performing its function, pacing through the afternoon, carrying them legally and with determination to New York. Margaret looked curiously at her husband, inactive in the middle of the afternoon on a train, at the other fortunate people traveling, at the sunny country outside, looked again to make sure, and then opened her book. The tune was still in her head. She hummed it and heard her husband take it up softly as he turned a page in his magazine. In the dining car, she ate roast beef, as she would have done in a restaurant at home, reluctant to change over too quickly to the new tantalizing food of a vacation. She had ice cream for dessert, but became uneasy over her coffee because they were due in New York in an hour, and she still had to put on her coat and hat, relishing every gesture. And Brad must take the suitcases down and put away the magazines. They stood at the end of the car for their interminable underground run, picking up their suitcases and putting them down again, moving restlessly inch by inch. The station was a momentary shelter, moving visitors gradually into a world of people and sound and light, to prepare them for the blasting reality of the street outside. She saw it for a minute from the sidewalk, before she was in a taxi moving into the middle of it, and then they were bewilderingly caught and carried on uptown and whirled out onto another sidewalk, and Brad paid the taxi driver and put his head back to look up at the apartment house. "This is it, all right," he said, as though he had doubted the driver's ability to find a number so simply given. Upstairs in the elevator, and the key fit the door. They had never seen their friend's apartment before, but it was reasonably familiar. A friend moving from New Hampshire to New York carries private pictures of a home not erasable in a few years, and the apartment had enough of home in it to settle Brad immediately in the right chair and comfort her with instinctive trust of the linen and blankets. "This is home for 2 weeks," Brad said, and stretched. After the first few minutes, they both went to the windows automatically. New York was below, as arranged, and the houses across the street were apartment houses filled with unknown people. "It's wonderful," she said. "There were cars down there, and people, and the noise was there. I'm so happy," she said, and kissed her husband. They went sightseeing the first day. They had breakfast in an automat and went to the top of the Empire State Building. "Got it all fixed up now," Brad said at the top. "Wondered just where that plane hit." They tried to peer down on all four sides, but were embarrassed about asking. "After all," she said reasonably, giggling in a corner, "if something of mine got broken, I wouldn't want people poking around asking to see the pieces." "If you owned the Empire State Building, you wouldn't care," Brad said. They traveled only in taxis the first few days, and one taxi had a door held on with a piece of string. They pointed to it and laughed silently at each other. And on about the third day, the taxi they were riding in got a flat tire on Broadway, and they had to get out and find another. "We've only got 11 days left," she said one day, and then, seemingly minutes later, "We've already been here 6 days." They had got in touch with friends they had expected to get in touch with. They were going to a Long Island summer home for a week. "It looks pretty dreadful right now," their hostess said cheerfully over the phone, "and we're leaving in a week ourselves. But I'd never forgive you if you didn't see it once while you were here." The weather had been fair but cool, with a definite autumn awareness. And the clothes in the store windows were dark and already hinting at furs and velvets. She wore her coat every day and suits most of the time. The light dresses she had brought were hanging in the closet in the apartment, and she was thinking now of getting a sweater in one of the big stores. Something impractical for New Hampshire, but probably good for Long Island. "I have to do some shopping at least one day," she said to Brad, and he groaned. "Don't ask me to carry packages," he said. "You aren't up to a good day's shopping," she told him. "Not after all this walking around you've been doing. Why don't you go to a movie or something?" "I want to do some shopping myself," he said mysteriously. Perhaps he was talking about her Christmas present. Perhaps she had thought vaguely of getting such things done in New York. The children would be pleased with novelties from the city, toys not seen in their home stores. "At any rate," she said, "you'll probably be able to get to your wholesalers at last." They were on their way to visit another friend who had found a place to live by a miracle and warned them consequently not to quarrel with the appearance of the building or the stairs or the neighborhood. All three were bad. And the stairs were 3 flights, narrow and dark, but there was a place to live at the top. Their friend had not been in New York long, but he lived by himself in 2 rooms and had easily caught the mania for slim tables and low bookcases, which made his rooms look too large for the furniture in some places, too cramped and uncomfortable in others. "What a lovely place," she said when she came in, and then was sorry when her host said, "Someday this damn situation will let up and I'll be able to settle down in a really decent place." There were other people there. They sat and talked companionably about the same subjects then current in New Hampshire, but they drank more than they would have at home, and it left them strangely unaffected. Their voices were louder and their words more extravagant. Their gestures, on the other hand, were smaller, and they moved a finger where in New Hampshire they would have waved an arm. Margaret said frequently, "We're just staying here for a couple of weeks on a vacation." And she said, "It's wonderful, it's so exciting." And she said, "We were terribly lucky. This friend went out of town just at the right." Finally, the room was very full and noisy, and she went into a corner near a window to catch her breath. The window had been opened and shut all evening, depending on whether the person standing next to it had both hands free, and now it was shut, with the clear sky outside. Someone came and stood next to her, and she said, "Listen to the noise outside. It's as bad as it is inside." He said, "In a neighborhood like this, someone's always getting killed." She frowned. "It sounds different than before. I mean, there's a different sound to it." "Alcoholics," he said. "Drunks in the street, fighting going on across the way." He wandered away carrying his drink. She opened the window and leaned out. There were people hanging out the windows across the way, shouting, and people standing in the street looking up and shouting. And from across the way, she heard clearly, "Lady, lady." They must mean me, she thought. They're all looking this way. She leaned out farther, and the voices shouted incoherently, but somehow making an audible whole, "Lady, your house is on fire, lady." She closed the window firmly and turned around to the other people in the room, raising her voice a little. "Listen," she said, "they're saying the house is on fire." She was desperately afraid of their laughing at her, of looking like a fool when Brad was across the room looking at her, blushing. She said again, "The house is on fire," and added, "They say," for fear of sounding too vehement. The people nearest to her turned, and someone said, "She says the house is on fire." She wanted to get Brad and couldn't see him. Her host was not in sight either, and the people all around were strangers. "They don't listen to me," she thought. "I might as well not be here." And she went to the outside door and opened it. There was no smoke, no flame, but she was telling herself, I might as well not be here. So she abandoned Brad in panic and ran without her hat and coat down the stairs, carrying a glass in one hand and a package of matches in the other. The stairs were insanely long, but they were clear and safe, and she opened the street door and ran out. A man caught her arm and said, "Everyone out of the house?" And she said, No, Brad is still there." The fire engine swept around the corner with people leaning out of the windows watching them, and the man holding her arm said, "It's down there," and left her. The fire was 2 houses away. They could see flames behind the top windows and smoke against the night sky. But in 10 minutes it was finished, and the fire engines pulled away with an air of martyrdom for hauling out all their equipment to put out a 10-minute fire. She went back upstairs slowly and with embarrassment and found Brad and took him home. "I was so frightened," she said to him when they were safely in bed. "I lost my head completely." "You should have tried to find someone," he said. "They wouldn't listen," she insisted. "I kept telling them, and they wouldn't listen, and then I thought I must have been mistaken. I had some idea of going down to see what was going on." "Lucky it was no worse," Brad said sleepily. "I felt trapped," she said, "high up in that old building with the fire. It's like a nightmare, and in a strange city." "Well, it's all over now," Brad said. The same faint feeling of insecurity tagged her the next day. She went shopping alone, and Brad went off to see hardware after all. She got on a bus to go downtown, and the bus was too full to move when it came out. Wedged standing in the aisle, she said, "Out, please," and "Excuse me," and by the time she was loose and near the door, the bus had started again, and she got off a stop beyond. "No one listens to me," she said to herself. "Maybe it's because I'm too polite." In the stores, the prices were all too high, and the sweaters looked disarmingly like New Hampshire ones. The toys for the children filled her with dismay. They were so obviously for New York children. Hideous little parodies of adult life, cash registers, tiny pushcarts with imitation fruit, telephones that really worked, as if there weren't enough phones in New York that really worked. Miniature milk bottles in a carrying case. "We get our milk from cows," Margaret told the salesgirl. "My children wouldn't know what these are." She was exaggerating, and she felt guilty for a minute, but no one was around to catch her. She had a picture of small children in the city dressed like their parents, following along with a miniature mechanical civilization, toy cash registers in larger and larger sizes that eased them into the real thing. Millions of clattering, jerking, small imitations that prepared them nicely for taking over the large, useless toys their parents lived by. She bought a pair of skis for her son, which she knew would be inadequate for the New Hampshire snow, and a wagon for her daughter, inferior to the one Brad could make it home in an hour. Ignoring the toy mailboxes, the small photographs with small special records, the kitty cosmetics, she left the store and started home. She was frankly afraid by now to take a bus. She stood on the corner and waited for a taxi. Glancing down at her feet, she saw a dime on the sidewalk and tried to pick it up. But there were too many people for her to bend down, and she was afraid to shove to make room for fear of being stared at. She put her foot on the dime, and then she saw a quarter near it, and a nickel. Someone dropped a pocketbook, she thought, and put her other foot on the quarter, stepping quickly to make it look natural. Then she saw another dime and another nickel and a third dime in a gutter. People were passing by her, back and forth all the time, rushing, pushing against her, not looking at her, and she was afraid to get down and start gathering up the money. Other people saw it and went past, and she realized that no one was going to pick it up. They were all embarrassed or in too much of a hurry or too crowded. A taxi stopped to let someone off, and she hailed it. She lifted her feet off the dime and the quarter and left them there when she got into the taxi. This taxi went slowly and bumped as it went. She had begun to notice that the gradual decay was not peculiar to the taxis. The buses were cracking open in unimportant seams, the leather seats broken and stained. The buildings were going too. In one of the nicest stores, there had been a great gaping hole in the tiled foyer, and you walked around it. Corners of the building seemed to be crumbling away into fine dust that drifted downward. The granite was eroding unnoticed. Every window she saw on her way uptown seemed to be broken. Perhaps every street corner was peppered with small change. The people were moving faster than ever before. A girl in a red hat appeared at the upper side of the taxi window and was gone beyond the lower side before you could see the hat. The store windows were so terribly bright because you could only catch them for a fraction of a second. The people seemed hurled on in a frantic action that made every 45 minutes long, every day 9 hours, every year 14 days. Food was so elusively fast, eaten in such a hurry that you were always hungry, always speeding to a new meal with new people. Everything was imperceptibly quicker every minute. She stepped into the taxi on one side and stepped out the other side at her home, and she pressed the 5th floor button on the elevator and was coming down again, bathed and dressed and ready for dinner with Brad. They went out for dinner and were coming in again, hungry and hurrying to bed in order to get to breakfast with lunch beyond. They had been in New York 9 days. Tomorrow was Saturday, and they were going to Long Island, coming home Sunday, and then Wednesday they were going home, really home. By the time she had thought of it, they were on the train to Long Island. The train was broken, the seats torn and the floor dirty. One of the doors wouldn't open and the windows wouldn't shut. Passing through the outskirts of the city, she thought, it's as though everything were traveling so fast that the solid stuff couldn't stand it and were going to pieces under the strain, cornices blowing off and windows caving in. She knew she was afraid to say it truly, afraid to face the knowledge that it was a voluntary neck-breaking speed, a deliberate whirling faster and faster to end in destruction. On Long Island, their hostess led them into a new piece of New York, a house filled with New York furniture as though on rubber bands, pulled this far, stretched taut, and ready to snap back to the city, to an apartment, as soon as the door was opened and the lease fully paid had expired. "We've had this place every year for simply ages," their hostess said. "Otherwise, we couldn't have gotten it possibly this year." "It's an awfully nice place," Brad said. "I'm surprised you don't live here all year round." "Got to get back to the city sometime," their hostess said and laughed. "Not much like New Hampshire," Brad said. He was beginning to get a little homesick. Margaret thought, he wants to yell, just once. Since the fire scare, she was apprehensive about large groups of people gathering together. When friends began to drop in after dinner, she waited for a while, telling herself they were on the ground floor, she could run right outside, all the windows were open. Then she excused herself and went to bed. When Brad came to bed much later, she woke up and he said irritably, "We've been playing anagrams. Such crazy people." She said sleepily, "Did you win?" and fell asleep before he told her. The next morning, she and Brad went for a walk while their host and hostess read the Sunday papers. "If you turn to the right outside the door," their hostess said encouragingly, "and walk about 3 blocks down, you'll come to our beach." "What do they want with our beach?" their host said. "It's too damn cold to do anything down there." "They can look at the water," said the hostess. They walked down to the beach. At this time of year, it was bare and windswept, yet still nodding hideously under traces of its summer plumage, as though it thought itself warmly inviting. There were occupied houses on the way there, for instance, and a lonely lunch stand was open, bravely advertising hot dogs and root beer. The man in the lunch stand watched them go by, his face cold and unsympathetic. They walked far past him, out of sight of houses, onto a stretch of gray pebbled sand that lay between the gray water on one side and the gray pebbled sand dunes on the other. "Imagine going swimming here," she said with a shiver. The beach pleased her. It was oddly familiar and reassuring, and at the same time that she realized this, the little tune came back to her, bringing a double recollection. The beach was the one where she had lived in imagination, writing for herself dreary, love-broken stories where the heroine walked beside the wild waves. The little tune was the symbol of the golden world she escaped into to avoid the everyday dreariness that drove her into writing depressing stories about the beach. She laughed out loud, and Brad said, "What on earth's so funny about this godforsaken landscape?" "I was just thinking how far away from the city it seems," she said falsely. The sky and the water and the sand were gray enough to make it feel like late afternoon instead of mid-morning. She was tired and wanted to go back, but Brad said suddenly, "Look at that." And she turned and saw a girl running down over the dunes, carrying her hat and her hair flying behind her. "Only way to get warm on a day like this," Brad remarked. But Margaret said, "She looks frightened." The girl saw them and came toward them, slowing down as she approached them. She was eager to reach them, but when she came within speaking distance, the familiar embarrassment, the not wanting to look like a fool, made her hesitate and look from one to the other of them uncomfortably. "Do you know where I can find a policeman?" she asked finally. Brad looked up and down the bare, rocky beach and said solemnly, "There don't seem to be any around. Is there something we can do?" "I don't think so," the girl said. "I really need a policeman." They go to these police for everything, Margaret thought. These people, these New York people. It's as though they had selected a section of the population to act as problem solvers, and so no matter what they want, they look for a policeman. "We'll be glad to help if you can," Brad said. The girl hesitated again. "Well, if you must know," she said crossly, "there's a leg up there." They waited politely for the girl to explain, but she only said, "Come on then," and waved them to follow her. She led them over the dunes to a spot near a small inlet, where the dunes gave way abruptly to an intruding head of water. A leg was lying on the sand near the water, and the girl gestured at it and said, "There," as though it were her own property and they had insisted on having a share. They walked over to it, and Brad bent down gingerly. "It's a leg, all right," he said. It looked like part of a wax dummy, a death-white wax leg neatly cut off at top thigh and again just above the ankle, bent comfortably at the knee and resting on the sand. "It's real," Brad said, his voice slightly different. "You're right about that policeman." They walked together to the lunch stand, and the man listened unenthusiastically while Brad called the police. When the police came, they all walked out again to where the leg was lying, and Brad gave the police their names and addresses and said, "Is it all right to go home now?" "What the hell you want to hang around for?" the policeman inquired with heavy humor. "You waiting for the rest of them?" They went back to their host and hostess, talking about the leg, and their host apologized as though he had been guilty of a breach of taste in allowing his guests to come upon a human leg. Their hostess said with interest, "There was an arm washed up in Bensonhurst. I've been reading about it." "One of these killings," the host said. Upstairs, Margaret said abruptly, "I suppose it starts to happen first in the suburbs." And when Brad said, "What starts to happen?" she said hysterically, "People starting to come apart." In order to reassure their host and hostess about their not minding the leg, they stayed until the last afternoon train to New York. Back in their apartment again, it seemed to Margaret that the marble in the house lobby had begun to age a little. Even in 2 days, there were new, perceptible cracks. The elevator seemed a little rusty, and there was the fine film of dust over everything. They went to bed feeling uncomfortable, and the next morning, Margaret said immediately, "I'm going to stay in today." "You're not upset about yesterday, are you?" "Not a bit," Margaret said. "I just want to stay in and rest." After some discussion, Brad decided to go off again by himself. He still had people it was important to see and places he must go to in the next days they had left. After breakfast in the automat, Margaret came back alone to the apartment, carrying the mystery story she had brought on the way. She hung up her coat and hat and sat down by the window with the noise and the people far below, looking out at the sky where it was gray beyond the houses across the street. "I'm not going to worry about it," she said to herself. "No sense thinking all the time about things like that. Spoil your vacation and Brad's too. No sense worrying. People get ideas like that and then worry about them." It was 11 o'clock. Brad was looking at blowtorches by now and would not be back before 1, if even then. She thought of writing a letter home, but the impulse left her before she found paper and pen. Then it occurred to her that she might take a nap, a thing she had never done in the morning in her life. And she went in and lay down on the bed. Lying down, she felt the building shaking. No sense worrying, she told herself again, as though it were a charm against witches, and got up and found her coat and hat and put them on. "I'll just get some cigarettes and some letter paper," she thought. "Just run down to the corner." Panic caught her going down in the elevator. It went too fast, and when she stepped out in the lobby, it was only the people standing around who kept her from running. As it was, she went quickly out of the building and into the street. For a minute, she hesitated, wanting to go back. The cars were going past so rapidly, the people hurrying as always, but the panic of the elevator drove her on finally. She went to the corner, and following the people flying along ahead, ran out into the street to hear a horn almost overhead and a shout from behind her and the noise of brakes. She ran blindly on and reached the other side where she stopped and looked around. The truck was going on its appointed way across the corner, the people going past on either side of her, parting to go around her where she stood. "No one even noticed me," she thought with reassurance. "Everyone who saw me has gone by long ago." She went into the drugstore ahead of her and asked the man for cigarettes. The apartment now seemed safer to her than the street. She could walk up the stairs. Coming out of the store and walking to the corner, she kept as close to the buildings as possible, refusing to give way to the rightful traffic coming out of the doorways. On the corner, she looked carefully at the light. It was green, but it looked as though it were going to change. Always safer to wait, she thought. don't want to walk into another truck. People pushed past her, and some were caught in the middle of the street when the light changed. One woman, more cowardly than the rest, turned and ran back to the curb, but the others stood in the middle of the street, leaning forward and then backward according to the traffic moving past them on both sides. One got to the farther curb in a brief break in the line of cars. The others were a fraction of a second too late and waited. Then the light changed again. And as the car slowed down, Margaret put a foot on the street to go, but a taxi swinging wildly around her corner frightened her back, and she stood on the curb again. By the time the taxi had gone, the light was due to change again, and she thought, I can wait once more. No sense getting caught out in the middle. A man beside her tapped his foot impatiently for the light to change. Two girls came past her and walked out into the street a few steps to wait, moving back a little when cars came too close, talking busily all the time. I ought to stay right with them, Margaret thought. But then they moved back against her, and the light changed, and the man next to her charged into the street, and the two girls in front waited a minute and then moved slowly on, still talking. And Margaret started to follow, and they decided to wait. A crowd of people formed around her suddenly. They had come off a bus and were crossing here, and she had a sudden feeling of being jammed in the center and forced out into the street, when all of them moved as one with the light changing, and she elbowed her way desperately out of the crowd and went off to lean against a building and wait. It seemed to her that people passing by were beginning to look at her. What do they think of me, she wondered, and stood up straight as though she were waiting for someone. She looked at her watch and frowned, and then thought, what a fool I must look like. No one here ever saw me before. They all go by too fast. The minute the light changes, she told herself firmly, there's no sense. The light changed before she was ready. And in the minute before she collected herself, traffic turning the corner overwhelmed her, and she shrank back against the curb. She looked longingly at the cigar store on the opposite corner, with her apartment house beyond. She wondered, how do people ever manage to get there? And knew that by wondering, by admitting a doubt, she was lost. And knew the light changed, and she looked at it with hatred, a dumb thing, turning back and forth with no purpose and no meaning. Looking to either side of her slyly, to see if anyone were watching, she stepped quietly backward, one step, two, until she was well away from the curb. Back in the drugstore again, she waited for some sign of recognition from the clerk and saw none. He regarded her with the same apathy as he had the first time. He gestured without interest at the telephone. He doesn't care, she thought. It doesn't matter to him who I call. She had no time to feel like a fool because they answered the phone immediately and agreeably and found her right away. When he answered the phone, his voice sounding surprised and matter-of-fact, she could only say miserably, I'm on the drugstore on the counter. Come and get me. What's the matter? He was not anxious to come. Please come and get me, she said into the black mouthpiece that might or might not tell him. Please come and get me, Brad. Please.
The Haunting of Hill House. If you do get the volume that we were talking about earlier, let me tell you, there's another thing about Shirley's writing. She's a beautiful writer about writing. And there's an essay in the book called Garlic in Fiction, in which she tells you how she gets the heroine of The Haunting of Hill House, Eleanor Vance, from point A to point B. Eleanor Vance is a woman who, in her childhood, experienced a rather frightening supernatural occurrence, and because of that, she is invited by a Dr. Montague to visit an isolated house. Of course, it's isolated, called Hill House, for an experiment in investigating the paranormal. Eleanor is introduced quite brilliantly by Shirley Jackson with this sentence: the only person in the world she genuinely hated, now that her mother was dead, was her sister. Eleanor commandeers the family car, and she's quite insistent that she owns half this car, and she drives the long distance to get to Hill House, and the first thing she has to do is to get past the literal gatekeeper, a dreadful man named Mr. Dudley. And once she gets past Mr. Dudley, she arrives at the house, and you will now hear what happens next.
No human eye can isolate the unhappy coincidence of line and place which suggests evil in the face of a house. And yet somehow, a maniac juxtaposition, a badly turned angle, some chance meeting of roof and sky turned Hill House into a place of despair. More frightening because the face of Hill House seemed awake, with a watchfulness from the blank windows and a touch of glee in the eyebrow of a cornice. Almost any house, caught unexpectedly or at an odd angle, can turn a deeply humorous look on a watching person. Even a mischievous little chimney or a dormer like a dimple can catch up a beholder with a sense of fellowship. But a house arrogant and hating, never off guard, can only be evil. This house, which seemed somehow to have formed itself, flying together into its own powerful pattern under the hands of its builders, fitting itself into its own construction of lines and angles, reared its great head back against the sky without concession to humanity. It was a house without kindness, never meant to be lived in, not a fit place for people or for love or for hope. Exorcism cannot alter the countenance of a house. Hill House would stay as it was until it was destroyed. I should have turned back at the gate, Eleanor thought. The house had caught her with an atavistic turn in the pit of the stomach, and she looked along the lines of its roofs, fruitlessly endeavoring to locate the badness, whatever dwelt there. Her hands turned nervously cold so that she fumbled trying to take out a cigarette. And beyond everything else, she was afraid, listening to the sick voice inside her which whispered, "Get away from here. Get away." But this is what I came so far to find, she told herself. I can't go back. Besides, he would laugh at me if I tried to get back out through that gate. Trying not to look up at the house, and she could not even have told its color or its style or its size, except that it was enormous and dark, looking down over her. She started the car again and drove up the last bit of driveway directly to the steps, which led in a forthright, no-escape manner onto the veranda and aimed at the front door. The drive turned off on either side to encircle the house, and probably later she could take her car around and find a building or some kind to put it in, but now she felt uneasily that she did not care to cut off her means of departure too completely. She turned the car just enough to move it off to one side, out of the way of later arrivals. It would be a pity, she thought grimly, for anyone to get a first look at this house with anything so comforting as a human automobile parked in front of it, and got out, taking her suitcase and her coat. Well, she thought inadequately, here I am. It was an act of moral strength to lift her foot and set it on the bottom step. And she thought that her deep unwillingness to touch Hill House for the first time came directly from the vivid feeling that it was waiting for her. Evil, but patient. Journeys end in lovers' meeting, she thought, and laughed, standing on the steps of Hill House. Journeys end in lovers' meeting. And she put her feet down firmly and went up to the veranda and the door. Hill House came around her in a rush. She was enshadowed, and the sound of her feet on the wood of the veranda was an outrage in the utter silence, as though it had been a very long time since feet stamped across the boards of Hill House. She brought her hand up to the heavy iron knocker that had a child's face, determined to make more noise and yet more, so that Hill House might be very sure she was there. And then the door opened without warning, and she was looking at a woman who, if like ever merited like, could only be the wife of the man at the gate. "Mrs. Dudley?" she said, catching her breath. "I'm Eleanor Vance. I'm expected."
Silently, the woman stood outside. Her apron was clean, her hair was neat.
and yet she gave an indefinable air of dirtiness, quite in keeping with her husband.
And the suspicious sullenness of her face was a match for the malicious petulance of his.
No, Eleanor told herself. It's partly because everything seems so dark around here, and partly because I expected that man's wife to be ugly. If I hadn't seen Hill House, would I be so unfair to these people? They only take care of it, after all. The hall in which they stood was overfull of dark wood and weighty carving, dim under the heaviness of the staircase, which lay back from the farther end. Above, there seemed to be another hallway, going the width of the house. She could see a wide landing, and then, across the staircase well, doors closed along the upper hall. On either side of her now were great double doors, carved with fruit and grain and living things. All the doors she could see in this house were closed. When she tried to speak, her voice was drowned in the dim stillness, and she had to try again to make a sound. "Can you take me to my room?" she asked at last, gesturing toward her suitcase on the floor and watching the wavering reflection of her hand going down and down into the deep shadows of the polished floor. "I gather I'm the first one here. You did say you were Mrs. Dudley?" "I think I'm going to cry," she thought, like a child sobbing and wailing. "I don't like it here."
Mrs. Dudley turned and started up the stairs.
And Eleanor took up her suitcase and followed, hurrying after anything else alive in this house. "No," she thought, "I don't like it here."
Mrs. Dudley came to the top of the stairs and turned right.
And Eleanor saw that with some rare perception, the builders of this house had given up any attempt at style, probably after realizing what the house was going to be, whether they chose it or not, and had, on this second floor, set in a long, straight hall to accommodate the doors to the bedrooms. She had a quick impression of the builders finishing off the second and third stories of the house with a kind of indecent haste, eager to finish their work without embellishment and get out of there, following the simplest possible pattern for the rooms. At the left end of the hall was a second staircase, probably going from the servants' rooms on the third floor down past the second to the service rooms below. At the right end of the hall, another room had been set in, perhaps, since it was on the end, to get the maximum amount of sun and light. Except for a continuation of the dark woodwork and what looked like a series of poorly executed engravings arranged with unlovely exactness along the hall in either direction, nothing broke the straightness of the hall except the series of doors, all closed.
Mrs. Dudley crossed the hall and opened a door, perhaps at random. "This is the blue room."
From the turn in the staircase, Eleanor assumed that the room would be at the front of the house, and she moved gratefully toward the light from the room. "How nice," she said, standing in the doorway, but only from the sense that she must say something. It was not nice at all, and only barely tolerable. It held enclosed the same clashing disharmony that marked Hill House throughout.
Mrs. Dudley turned aside to let Eleanor come in and spoke, apparently to the wall. "I set dinner on the dining room sideboard at 6 sharp, she said. "You can serve yourselves. I clear up in the morning. I have breakfast ready for you at 9. That's the way I agreed to do. I can't keep the rooms up the way you'd like, but there's no one else you could get that would help me. I don't wait on people. What I agreed to, it doesn't mean I wait on people."
Eleanor nodded, standing uncertainly in the doorway.
"I don't stay after I set out dinner," Mrs. Dudley went on. "Not after it begins to get dark. I leave before dark comes."
"I know," Eleanor said.
"We live over in the town, 6 miles away.
"Yes," Eleanor said.
So there won't be anyone around if you need help."
"I understand."
"We wouldn't even hear you in the night."
"I don't suppose..."
"No one could. No one lives nearer than the town. No one else will come any nearer than that."
"I know," Eleanor said tiredly.
"In the night," Mrs. Dudley said, and smiled outright. "In the dark," she said, and closed the door behind her.
Eleanor almost giggled, thinking of herself calling, "Oh, Mrs. Dudley, I need your help in the dark." And then she shivered. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Shirley Jackson family, 4 generations, including Shirley tonight. And thank you, Kerry O'Malley, Annabeth Gish, and Benjamin Dreyer. Here's to 2026. May it be healthy and good.